I'll just make sure no one is walking down the hall and then begin. I know that there were more than a few people sent me a message today saying that today was not the day that they were going to show up to class, which is fine. I get it. People have different schedules and lives outside of a contemporary literature class. I'm not vitriolic about it at all. Okay, so before we get into our topic for this week, I just want to make sure, does anyone have anything from yesterday that they wanted to bring up or question or make sure of before we move on? Obviously, it's all related in some way, shape, or form, right? As designed by a masterful professor, naturally. But yeah, just making sure. That's one of the advantages, I guess, of having a class a day. We can just constantly come back to that, but we're all good. Okay. One of the things that we didn't get around to talking about in a way that I'm, again, not disappointed in, but it's just a statement of fact, is how a big part of the play, Angélique, is also about observation, right? Which makes sense. On the one hand, it is a theater play, as I mentioned. You're meant to observe it on the stage. There is a level of looking and observing and examining in full view actors playing these roles. Okay? Which might seem like an obvious statement to make about theater, but when it's done right, thematically, it can actually be used to excellent effect. Okay? And you can think of a million theater people who actually have done this. And it would be interesting to actually think about, and we're not going to do it now, but maybe it's an essay topic, how that would actually play out, especially in the context of some of the scenes that we briefly mentioned, like when François and Ignace are behind the two-paned mirror, the double mirror, right? The double-sided mirror, observing Angélique and César, quote unquote, in their natural habitat, like they're animals in a zoo, right? And so there's this bizarre, how could I put it? There's this bizarre doubling going on, or juxtaposition of you as an audience member looking at other people, right? But that colonial observation, in this case in the most literal sense of slave owners looking at their slaves, right, doing things that they are forcing them to do, is par for the course in a lot of literature. Okay? And it's something that, even though we didn't touch upon, is, I think, a really crucial way of connecting yesterday's topic to today's, right? And what kind of observation both Liz Howard and Jordan Abel are responding to in very specific ways. And when I say observation, I don't necessarily mean exclusively through literally looking, right? There are all kinds of observations, and all of these can be coded in differing ways. You probably got it most clearly from the Jordan Abel poem. I'm not sure, right? Although Liz Howard's True Value is quite explicitly about observation, except for different reasons. So yesterday's form of observation was about slave owners and slaves, and I was thinking about a question that, Mel, you had asked earlier. I think this was on Monday, about no, it would have been on Tuesday, right? Because it was after Tish. And you were wondering if, on some level, a lot of these poets in the 60s and 70s were kind of appropriating or indigenizing their voice, right? Whether consciously or not. Right? And my answer had been, just for the sake of the class, that I don't think as a movement they were doing that necessarily, or if they were doing so, it wasn't conscious. Right? But to come full circle, it is certainly something that you have seen on individual poetic levels, right? Individual poets in Canada and elsewhere have absolutely done this, right? Taking an Indigenous voice or their perception, right? Their observation of Indigenous voices, and then channeling it through their own voices. Often to shockingly great effect, right? Which is what makes it so difficult to read those poems, right? They're often technically good, right? On a technical compositional level, but they are morally reprehensible, right? Which, especially for us in the 21st century, when they were published, it was perfectly acceptable because they were published, right? It's kind of a vicious self-fulfilling element there. And the example I have of this is actually from Duncan Campbell Scott, who some of you might have heard of. Has anyone actually? The name? He's well known now not for his poetry. He was actually a government official, and he's one of the modern architects of the residential schools. So had you genuinely heard of him?
Yeah, I just took Indigenous politics.
Right. Okay. So that would have been that Duncan Campbell Scott, right? So, but when I say modern day engineers, he was part of the civil service in like the early 20th century. So by then, the residential schools had been well established, right? But he was certainly a part of the institutions that wanted to maintain them and quote unquote update them for the modern times, right? Contradictory as that may be as a statement. Right? But he has a poem that I've chosen here to be rather representative of this kind of observational poetics that I'm talking about. And sorry, I didn't show you the title, but it's called The Onondaga Madonna. And it reads, "She stands full-throated with a careless pose, this woman of a weird and waning race, the tragic savage lurking in her face, where all her pagan passion burns and glows. Her blood is mingled with her ancient foes, and thrills with war and wildness in her veins. Her rebel lips are dabbed with the stains of feuds and forays of her and her father's woes. And closer in the shawl about her breast, the latest promise of her nation's doom. Paler than she, her baby clings and lies, the primal warrior gleaming from his eyes. He sulks, and burdened with his infant gloom, he draws his heavy brows and will not rest."
This one rhymes.
At least this one rhymes. That's what I mean by, I guess technically it is a competently written poem, right? Duncan Campbell Scott is considered to be a part of a generation called the Confederation poets, right? Which were people like Charles G. Roberts, who was actually, I think, a little bit better as a poet, and Archibald Lackman. Shocking no one, a lot of these guys are men, right? But they were considered to be a kind of first generation of quote unquote good Canadian poets, like homegrown Canadian poets, right? Which of course makes their legacy a little bit dicey considering works like this. Right? Now, thematically speaking, what do we notice in this poem? We're not going to spend that long on it, but I think it's a good way of going into some of our topics for today. I think we'll better understand Howard and Abel's poetry if we know what they're responding to. Well, first of all, what is this about on the most basic level? Yeah, okay, good. So the Onondaga Madonna Onondaga, I don't, as far as I know, doesn't mean anything. It's like a fabricated indigenous sounding name. I might be wrong on this, but I think. So yeah, he's describing an indigenous woman. In the first stanza, he's describing her. Second stanza, what is he describing? Yeah, her child. Okay, so good. Let's start with the first stanza. What do we notice about his description of this woman?
It describes the stereotypical indigenous person like a savage.
Okay, so good. Savage. Right, in line 3, the tragic savage lurking in her face. Lurking being a rather derogatory way of saying that. Right? What else? What other kind of stereotypes? What we would now consider stereotypes, of course.
The pagan reference.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
The pagan reference.
Okay, so paganism. Yeah, Duncan Campbell Scott was nothing if not a Christian man, right? With all of those associated values. Yeah, Billy.
The rebel lips are dark with the stains.
Rebel lips dabbled with the stains of feuds and forays of her father's foes. Right? There's like this warrior trope, right? That ties back in to the savage, right? Above.
Weird and waning race.
What about the waning race?
Just like weird colonizer aspect.
Okay, good. We'll hold on to that. You have your hand up. Okay. So the waning race. The colonizer aspect, but it goes beyond that, actually. It's a specific type of discourse that was associated with that time, if you know it. No, go ahead.
I was going to say genocide, but I'm.
Well, yes, in part. Well, yes. But I would say it's a specific framing of that genocide because they didn't understand it as genocide at the time. Or they didn't acknowledge it as such.
It's like the patriarchal view of the noble savage.
Mm-hmm. Good. First of all, noble savage, right? So, yes, she is savage, but also she's full-throated, right? Yeah?
He's like talking about her relationship with like many different ancient foes.
Mm-hmm.
Relationship to those.
Okay. So all of that's coming together. Go ahead and then I'll say it.
I was going to say that, like, is that more like how indigenous people are very connected with their ancestors?
So yeah, that would be another trope, right? And that's not to say that that never happens within any population, the idea of like connecting to an ancestor, but to emphasize it as just the quote unquote normal part of every, I'm using the term Indian here because in this case, it's a trope. Right?
Is it because she's like hopelessly warlike?
So the waning race here is actually a reference to the idea that indigenous people were a disappearing race, right? That was a very common discourse at the time. Right. So we didn't use the term genocide, first of all, because the term had not been coined yet, right? The term only emerges, I think, about 50 years after this poem came out, right? After World War II, of course. So we had the concept of disappearing race, and part of that was based in the idea of civilizational steps, basically, right? That was very common at the time. Right? Pseudoscience is what we would call it today, right? But at the time, it was understood that different races and different civilizations went through progressive steps, and naturally, from the perspective of someone like Scott and his peers, white men like themselves were the pinnacle of that evolutionary process. Okay? And everything else, such as the indigenous woman that he's describing, is slowly disappearing. Not because of any policies that he would have implemented naturally. I say that with the utmost sarcasm, if you do not pick up on that. But because they are naturally inferior and doomed to disappearance. Notice also to what extent it's sexualized as a poem. right? What parts of it are rather sexualized? In a creepy way, like I should say that, right?
Pagan passion and the rebel lips.
Pagan passion burns and glows. We saw that yesterday, actually, in the play, right? The way that François talks about Angélique, right? That same discourse is coming across. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right? It's not as necessarily sexualized as the passion burns and glows, but the idea of really emphasizing the gendered aspect of motherhood, right, certainly plays into that. The waning race element, of course, comes back into the stanza on the child, right? It's promising because all children in literature represent hope and promise for the future by definition. But he's paler and he lies, right? He's sulking and he's burdened. This child is probably not going to survive. Right, go ahead, sorry.
Oh, I was gonna say, is it like just saying like the latest promise of our nations do, and then like being paler? Is it maybe not like it's like sort of a white water or something?
Oh, okay, yeah.
There?
I read it as like deathly pale,
okay.
Right? But because to me, if it were a white father, the concept of a métis was already present, right? So I guess that would. I feel like knowing other poems of the time, right? That would have been a way for him to say that there's hope for that child's future because of the whiteness.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
But I could be wrong. There might be a reading of this poem, but I can't quite make that loud. Yeah. It's not a bad impulse, though, to think of it in that way. Like I said, I didn't want to spend a whole lot of time on this, but I do think it's a vivid example. I can put it up on Moodle if people want to reference it. Yes? Okay. No, it's fine. Guys, I saw you take a picture of it, which is okay, but I just wanted to make sure. Okay. What was I going to say? Yes, okay. Does anyone else have any points to make about this before we move on? Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I wasn't very clear about the herpletis part, but what it kind of reminded me of, in terms of like the sexualization, was like Perez saying to Angelique, like, you liked it, like she knows it's her enemy, but like that assumption, that kind of like audacity.
Yeah. Audacity is a good word for this. Yeah. But the idea of blood mingled and then, the emphasis of the use of thrills, right? It adds a violence, right, to her character that is rather contradictory with the fact that she's also supposed to be a caring mother, quote unquote. Except not so caring since her child is starving. Again, completely unrelated to any policy that Scott would have made. But yeah, the idea of a violent and warlike, quote unquote, savage was par for the course. So that's the kind of, to come back to that initial question, that's the kind of appropriation that we're seeing and observation that we're seeing, at least on a literary level. I know there's I don't know if I'll be able to find it on Google. Let's see if I can actually do this. No. I know I have it in a book somewhere. I'll try to find it. There's a great picture. I say great because of how insightful it is. But of Scott's peer, poetic peer, Charles Z.G. Roberts, giving a poetic reading, and he's literally dressed like a native chief. Right? We look at it now and we find it kind of ridiculous and appalling, right? But again, it wouldn't have been that out of place at the time, right? I was trying to find that picture, but I'm not going to spend too much time on that. Okay. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about today as part of the quote-unquote lecture, aside from giving a little bit of literary context here, is also a question that we had asked yesterday. Mark had insightfully asked the question, right, is Canada better than places like France or England, which tend to have a lot of difficulty addressing their colonial past? And it's a very valid question. I think just the fact that we are talking about it today in a classroom setting so openly, right, is a good step, right? I know I have some peers at the university that I teach at sometimes in Montreal that are still squeamish, right, about addressing these topics, mostly because of their undeserved fears of quote-unquote cancel culture, which I find a weird circuitous logic, but anyway, that's a discussion for another time. So there is still a little bit of pushback, I think, in an academic context of fully leaning into these discussions. But I think overall, the fact that these discussions are happening at all is great. And one of the questions that we came up with yesterday was, is Canada post-colonial? No, good. A lot of people would agree with that, I think, right? But what does, I guess, it entail to say, is Canada post-colonial? What does post-colonial actually mean? Is a question that we could spend the rest of our semester on, by the way. Right? There are literally entire classes dedicated to what's called post-colonial literature. Okay? So we're not going to necessarily do that today, but it is a question worth contemplating. What does it mean to go past the colonial moment? Because there's plenty of ways that you could do this. On a political level, does it mean literally tearing down the entire foundations of the government that we currently have and replacing it with something that we consider to be a decolonized government? Maybe. I don't know. I genuinely don't know. Right? Because I'm not the person who's most affected by this at the end of the day. Right? Technically, I could be considered, right, among a minority group. My dad's Arabic, right? But it's ultimately not something that super affects me at the end of the day, right? It's not my fight, right? But it's still something that I think is important to discuss. On a cultural level, I think it's already a lot better, right? The way that we see an openness to publishing so many books by authors of various kinds, for example. I see your face, Lee. Better, not perfect, I should say. Better than it was just 10 years ago, for example, 15 years ago, right? So there is progress happening, right? Slowly, too slowly, but surely. Go ahead, say what you have to say.
No, I just think if you ever have a chance, you should connect with Dr. Kelly Saunders.
Dr. Saunders.
She just taught an Indigenous politics class for the mini class, and she would say totally different. But she would definitely probably enjoy a conversation about it.
Just saying that it's better doesn't mean I would disagree with, I don't disagree with a lot of Indigenous activists or any kind of minority activists who say that there is significant changes that need to be done, right? I'm not saying that at all.
You just mean there's no more residential schools.
Yeah, okay, right. We're at 2% better, right, is what I'm saying, right? Technically better, but still need a lot of work,
We're starting to talk about it though.
Yeah. Mhm.
Like I never heard any of this stuff when I was in school.
Exactly. Right. That's exactly what I'm saying. Right. And the fact that, for example, there are so many, again, better, but not, statistically, that there are Indigenous professors, right? Jordan Abel, for example, is one. He teaches at University of Manitoba, right? He teaches creative writing there, I think, or Edmonton, one or the other. Yeah. And then I saw your hand. And now I lost my train of thought. Or I remember talking to someone in publishing, for example, based in, again, Quebec, but and saying how in a lot of publishing houses, especially smaller ones, but not exclusively, you see an active push to, encourage Indigenous voices, for example, right? There has never been so many Indigenous books published in Canada as there have been right now. Okay. Again, there's a whole thing that you can add here about the politics of publication, right? Which of those books get to the front of the list, for example, and how they decide to play into that whole game. But still, technically speaking, it is better. And yet, despite all of these improvements, I still don't think a lot of people would say that we are a post-colonial nation. The fact that we still need to talk about these as things that need to be done, right, or need to be improved on, kind of proves the point that we are not past it.
Same way we're not past post-patriarchy.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. That whole discussion that we had yesterday, that brief tangent that we had on like the expectation to put out, right, still being somehow a thing, is par for the course, right? Pay gap. Mm-hmm. All these things, right? Yes, Billy, you had your hand up.
I was gonna say that when she was talking about when like we were in school and stuff, that it was nothing. Today I actually was subbing in the Brand School Division, and they have now twice already in the past 2 weeks that they've had an elder in the school going to each of the classrooms with stuff, and then today they had a drumming and a dancer in the gym doing an assembly. Yeah. And I don't think I ever remember going to the gym for an assembly for something that was Indigenous.
No. Some of you might have missed this because it was technically outside of class time that we had this conversation, but I remember talking about it with some of the people who were sitting here near the front. That is one of the things that I'm most pleasantly shocked by when I arrived in Manitoba, and specifically here in Brandon, is just to what extent, right, Indigenous initiatives and iconography and so on is just there, present, right? Just in the 20-minute walk that I take from where I'm renting to the university, there's there's plaques up and statues. There's the Indigenous Youth Center, who's the Friendship Center, right? I don't know if it's good or not. I just see that it's there, right? Which is something I would never see in Quebec, by the way, right? And I live in its biggest city, right? And I never see that. There are sometimes events like the ones that you're describing, Billy. I could not even name you one Indigenous politician that we have, let alone our premier. Right? And yet you guys have, well, can you? Yeah. So yeah, that was one thing that I was literally telling my friends about it. I was like, this is great stuff. Yeah, and I remember I've been to Manitoba before, but it just never struck me as much. Right? So yeah, keep up the good work, is what I'm saying on that. Yeah, go ahead. You had your hand up?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Is area conversation?
Yeah.
So isn't most countries is
So I cannot speak for all countries, naturally, right? But just to give you an example of how, from what I've engaged with very briefly, you see this in a lot of African countries, for example, right? where they would not consider themselves, or a lot of at least intellectuals who write about this would not consider themselves post-colonial. For example, because they're still so tied to former colonial masters, right? It's what we call neo-colonialism. Okay? You saw this in Mali recently, right? There was a coup, right? And part of the logic behind that governmental overthrow, I'm pretty sure it's Mali, was a active resistance against the fact that a lot of their industries were still owned by French companies in 2026. Right? So while technically speaking, Mali is an independent nation, if all your money goes to an overseas power, right, is that just colonialism under a different name? A lot of people would say yes. Right?
Also, at a much more I guess, grassroots level, we just lived in the UK for 4 years. And I have 2 kids, and they were in school. And the messaging very much is that Britain has always been the hero of the story, of every story. There's no talking about anything wrong that they have ever done in history.
Yeah.
Which is wild.
We brought them science and tea. Death. But we don't talk about that.
No.
But yeah, that's another good example. The refusal to talk about it, right, from the perspective of the perpetrators is also an indication of a lack of post-coloniality. To take another example, right, in Asia, just to take a different part of the world, right, that whole debacle during the 60s and 70s, right, of the Vietnam War. How dare these Asian countries want to be self-sufficient and independent, right? So once the French and British left, who came in? Yeah, the Americans. And us too, but we didn't acknowledge it then. We were there in the background. But this kind of interventionist politics, right, is still extremely present. Hell, actually, I don't even need to go back to the 70s. What happened in Venezuela last year?
Right? Their president.
They just walked into their country, took their president. If that's not a colonial move, I don't know what it is. Just blatant. And I know I'm getting frustrated and very active, right? But I can go on and on and on about these examples, right?
Is that like why? Sorry.
No, please.
Is that why Ethiopia is like 2013 or 2015? Because they were not colonized and don't have any ties to
What are you talking about? Ethiopia? I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, what about it? Sorry,
It's in the year 2013, right?
Yeah, is that why it's in the year 2013? They're not colonized.
So what? I'm not following. What do you mean?
So it's 2026 here.
Yeah.
It's 2013 there.
Oh, like they use a different calendar.
Yeah, I think it was colonized though.
Oh,
it was not colonized.
Yeah.
Really? I'm sure it was. Because I know I learned that in history and
Right. Okay. Yeah. So it wouldn't have never. Technically, yeah. So it's probably one of those things that's a technicality. I'm not going to spend the next hour just staring at Wikipedia until I find the answer. What I think is happening there is, while it was never technically colonized, right, in the sense that a power took over, right, actively, it's probably one of those things that there's a great deal of external influence, right, that was exerted on it, because you can see this on in elements like the fact that in Ethiopia they still speak majority English, right? You don't get that from being a nation that's completely independent, right? There's historical reasons for that. But again, this is not a situation that I'm like super well versed in, so I might be talking entirely hot air, right? Okay. So rant aside, 25 minutes later, important rant aside. Obviously, we're not going to sit here and solve the problems of what does it mean to decolonize. But the question, as I mentioned yesterday, is important because in order to get to a post-colonial nation state or a post-colonial community, the implication is that you must first decolonize, right? You have to remove a certain element in order to go past it, right? And for us in literary studies, at the very least, one of the ways in which to decolonize is through culture, right? And literature. So how do you go from, did I close it? Yeah, I closed it. But how do you go from something like Scott and his poetry to something like Liz Howard's poetry? Arguably, Howard and Abel are engaging in a poetics of decolonialism or decolonization, whatever term you want to use. How that actually plays out can be a topic for conversation, right? There are many ways that can happen. We briefly touched upon it, even without naming it as such, when we talked about Armstrong and Philip from Class 1. Right? They are enacting a kind of poetics of decolonization on the level of form, right? Not respecting the standards, right, that would have been brought over. Probably that's most obvious in Abel as well, right, on the level of form. We're going to get to his poems in a bit. Maybe less so for Howard, at least formalistically. But there's probably a lot to say for this poem as a kind of decolonial praxis as well, right? On the level of what it stages as a conversation and why it actually does so. There's probably also something to say about how these poems are a form of decolonization in the way that they are addressing the topic from a particularly contemporary standpoint, right? Contrary to people like Armstrong and Philip, right, who are inevitably concerned with history, rightfully so. Something like Watershed and Shield Reminiscence doesn't necessarily address deep history, right, in that same sense. I mean, it doesn't talk about Christopher Columbus, but it's talking about pollution in a way that could absolutely be read as a form of neocolonialism. Right? Where do we dump our toxic waste, for example? I can tell you for sure it's not here. Right? Which is, of course, one of the reasons why thinkers like Max Liboiron, who's in Newfoundland, has a very powerfully titled book called Pollution is Colonialism, which I encourage you to check out. It's not a literary text, but it's an interesting text to consider nonetheless. Rather theoretically dense, but still interesting. So what does it mean to decolonize? I just gave you a few, but does anyone want to add anything to that one? What might it mean to decolonize for you? I think the one that frustrates me the most, and again, I see this a lot from where I'm from, which is why I'm so impressed by Manitoba, is, I'm not saying that you don't have that here, but one of the ways that people think a decolonizing action is taking place is in official statements. We acknowledge that we are on unceded Indigenous lands, right? In Montreal, it's on Kanien'kehá:ka territory, right? Before every conference, I was at a conference this afternoon, right? I was at an online conference, but it's taking place in Montreal, right? Every presenter, I acknowledge that I'm on unceded lands of treaty whatever, right? Every single time. Every time I go to an address by the dean of our university, nous affirmons que nous sommes sur les territoires non cédés autochtones. That's just French for exactly the same thing.
There's something to be said for the
Yes.
normalizing of hearing those words.
Yes.
So obviously it's not enough, so we're near enough. It's the beginnings of.
But that's where my frustration is, actually. Because it sounds great, but it's so polished and it's so devoid, I think, of actual practice that I think it defangs the actual statement.
I'm from Edmonton.
Yeah.
And I think I met like maybe 3 Indigenous people my whole life growing up there before I moved away. But then there was an initiative last time that we lived there where they just renamed a bunch of the roads in Edmonton Indigenous names. And they didn't explain anything about it. They didn't say where they got the names, what they meant, or even how to pronounce them. So like, we don't know how to pronounce these words, so we're just going to use the old words.
Yeah.
It was totally meaningless.
Yeah, absolutely. You see that all over the place. I can name you at least 5 different examples in Montreal where exactly the same thing happened. And again, like, I'm not going to stand here and say, no, you shouldn't do something like that, right? Like, at the end of the day, it's not harmful, but it doesn't advance, I think, the cause as much as it thinks it does, is my point. Yeah, it is very performative. Right? That's another term that's kind of bandied around, right? Like performative X, Y, and Z. Like, are you a performative male or whatever? I'm not that much into, like, anyway. But there's a positive way that you can frame performativity, right? We all perform certain things, but yeah, there's definitely a negative side to performativity that can occur in exactly these types of examples. Okay. Any questions or concerns? Good. Was there anything else that I wanted to... Oh, yeah. Another thing that we can, I guess, consider, right, as a way in which literature can decolonize, right, or at least get us to think about practices of decolonization, is actually through a very classic question in Canadian literature. Right? I didn't bring it up in relation to the Tisch Poetry Group, but that question was coined during that time. And it was coined by probably our most famous literary critic, a guy from Sherbrooke called Northrop Frye. Name might mean something to you. Yeah. By far, right, the most well-known critic of Canadian literature, despite being somewhat dated, of course, because he was writing 75 years ago at this point. But in his famous conclusion to a literary history of Canada, which was published in 1956, he asked, or he claimed that the question that motivates so much Canadian literature up until the point that he was writing is the question, do I have a chalk here? No. That might seem counterintuitive at first. But he provocatively asked this question. Where is here? Why is that so provocative? Why might literary people in Canada, especially around the centennial, take this question super seriously? Where is here? What's implied in the question? What are the downfalls of that question?
Like, who are we and where do we stand in relation to our history?
Exactly. He was looking at it specifically from a point of view of articulating the landscape around us. Right? Famously, he had this thesis that most Canadian literature was centered around what he called the garrison mentality. Soldiers in a garrison versus the unknown in the forest. What's out there? Out there can kill you. Out there is terrifying. Out there are full-throated savages and bears. Right? And a lot of early Canadian literature is that, right? Beautiful sentences that are ultimately super racist, right? But the where is here question also concerns, right? How do we actually relate to and live on this land that we call ours? And Fry, by the way, was not unaware of Indigenous issues, right? He was not an idiot. Right? What he was still expressing, nonetheless, is what animated a lot of his peers. I actually don't know what Fry's politics personally were about that, but he did identify, I think, correctly what motivated a lot of the literature that he was examining, which is that question of, how do I make this mine? How do I make this territory around me represent me? That's what's implied in the where is here question. And it's a question that I think still animates some literature, not as much as it used to, in part because of the fact that we are slightly better, 2% better. But it also animates a lot of the poetry by people like the ones that we're looking at today that are still operating in opposition to the downfalls of that question, or that the question was not taken as critically as it should have. I might be able to make an exam question out of this one, I'm not sure. Hint, hint. Suddenly, you're taking notes. I'm joking. Okay. Does anyone have a poem that they would like to start us off with? We have 3 for today. And depending on which one we might want to talk about first, I'll go to one slide or another. Does anyone have any special requests?
Yeah.
Want True Value first? Okay, yeah. Okay. Good. True Value is a fantastic poem, isn't it? Yeah. I think it's a fantastic poem, not because I'm happy when I read it, right? That's not what's happening. But I think it gets at what the best poetry does, which is evoke a feeling in the reader that you never knew you were going to feel. If you know a poem's successful, it makes you feel something that you've never felt before. Right? That's why, unfortunately, I think Scott's Onondaga Madonna is successful as a poem. It elicits an emotion. The emotion that I receive from it, however, is not the same that Scott intended me to receive. I think Scott wanted you to feel pity. I feel anger.
At him.
At him, of course. I think True Value does a similar thing. It's also anger, in some ways. Also disgust, disappointment, and so on. But it's an emotion nonetheless that's being elicited in you as the reader. What kind of emotions it elicits very much, I think, enters into that decolonizing praxis that you might identify. By the way, just in case you're curious, this is Liz Howard. She's been very well recognized in the field of poetry. If I'm not mistaken, it was her first poetry collection, from which Watershed and Shield Reminiscence is from. So Infinite Citizen of the Shaking Tent. I think it was awarded, I don't think it was the Governor General's Award, but it was very well recognized. Infinite Citizen of the Shaking Tent. I should have looked this up. The Griffin Poetry Prize. Right, so very well respected. Letters of the Bruised from a Bruised Cosmos is the collection that features True Value. Both are phenomenal. Right? If you like those poems, check out her 2 poetry collections. Great. And because she's a contemporary poet, right? Infinite Citizen was published in 2016, and Letters from a Bruised Cosmos, I think, was 2023 or 2024, something along those lines. She's still, giving poetry readings and doing the circuit, so you might actually encounter her if you're interested in things like that. Let's see. Yeah, there was nothing else actually I wanted to do. Yes, the only thing I showed Billy this while we were waiting for class to start, but I just thought it was funny. You have no reason to find that interesting or any way, shape, or form, but I think it's kind of fun. If ever you're wondering if you should write in books, by the way, my answer to that is yes. This is a picture of my copy of True Value at home. I didn't bring it with me because I had limited space in my bag, but write on your poetry, right? Write on your books. It's fine, right? In this case, I was doing like actual poetic analysis, right? So identifying words and so on and so forth, making connections, but do that, right? It's fantastic as an exercise. Also, and this has nothing to do with anything, but it's just a tangent within a tangent. I find it infinitely cool when I buy a used book and there are annotations in it, because I get to see what that previous person responded to. And it's like having a literary conversation through time, and that's just neat. Right? Do with that information what you will. That's it. Does anyone want to read True Value for us so I can take a sip of water?
I was never my fault. If I died, other?
Yeah.
True value was common. The sky was never my forte. If I died once, if I left the body, have this purpose?
Yep.
This is not my grave. The value in the dead woman is that she cannot kill again or impossible. The value in being the dead woman that child is the sound of her purpose. The value in being dead is that it's in poets. It will be. What is called wellness, victimness, a swab taken of every orifice. Were there any identifying marks? Were you in fact one that night, Miss Howard? Did you make a choice? I made a thought there would be something.
Thank you. Let's go all the way back up. The sky was never my court date. I know it might get tedious sometimes to say that, but especially, actually, no, we're not even going to start with that. I'm going to start with the title. True value. The first thing I thought of, right, when I saw that title, because I had never read the poem before, I didn't know what it was about, right, was the small hardware store chain. Some of you might have seen it, right? There's some in Canada, right? But it also implies its opposite, right? It is kind of cheap, right, at the end of the day. Right, whenever you go to maybe like the superstore or whatever, and it's like the super value pack or whatever, right? It's usually like the biggest slab of meat you've ever seen, and it's probably not that healthy for you, right? So there's a kind of contradiction that we've now associated in our mind between what is valuable or not, right? What constitutes true value, and usually it's having a bang for your buck, right? The most bang for your buck, I should say. And even if it's not explicitly about that, as I hope you've picked up on, right? I don't think it's that dense necessarily of a poem that you can't figure out what it's about. I think she is also playing with these contradictions, right, of what we associate value to, right? Or how we quantify value. It's easy to quantify like, oh, I got screwed in how much I paid for X, Y, and Z product. It's less easy to quantify value when we're talking about the safety of a human being, or even in a legal sense, right? You see this all the time, especially in cases like the one that she's describing here. How much compensation do you get for your troubles? If it's anything, is it ever even worth it? Like, can you put a monetary value on these types of things? Not really. Technically, in a legal sense, you can, but it's not, it never quite reaches that same place. So, true value. I think the first line is probably the hardest line in the poem. And then it gets somewhat clearer at the end, or by the end. But what do we make of it? The sky was never my court date. It does what very good poetry usually does. It immediately sets the scene. How, we're not quite sure yet, because we haven't read the rest of the poem, but just by the use of court date, it immediately invokes a certain image in our mind. But then we ask, of course, the question, is she the accused? Is she the one who's the aggrieved party, right? Again, that question is deliberately contradictory because I think she's playing with that. The aggrieved accused. Aside from court date, what else do we make of this? Why the sky was never my court date?
Like you said, you know how they mix the sky is like that. I feel like that's what
Yeah. The sky's the limit. We can do anything, right? If you put your mind to it, you can be president of the whatever, right? But the use of never suddenly just in the middle of that line immediately negates the possibility. You start off, the sky was, your brain is prepping itself as it usually does when you read something, you expect the next word, and then never. You immediately halt in the middle of the line. The sky is the limit. Nope. The sky was never. It's a complicated line, mostly because it doesn't make logical sense in our mind, right? Obviously, a sky cannot be a court date. But I think if you're right, Ebube, on the metaphorical level, right, insofar as what I think she's implying is the idea that the court date is not going to give her that possibility, right? The possibility implied by the sky.
I thought it was bad luck that she had that. I think when maybe she's trying to say that, or maybe she thinks she had bad luck. Of course, it's not getting something.
But having bad luck implies that you still had a chance, right? You say, oh, I had bad luck when you roll snake eyes at the casino, right? You say, oh, I have bad luck if you missed your favorite TV. No, that doesn't really exist anymore in the era of streaming. But when you missed your favorite TV show when cable was still a thing, right? But the use of the term never here, again, does a lot of heavy lifting. Implies that it was never, obviously, that the possibility did not exist, right? So it's no longer a question of luck. It's a question of facing the reality. Yeah, go ahead, Lee.
Is it like reshaping? I'm hoping I'm reshaping what you said just to understand better.
Yeah,
Is
yeah.
it like saying like the it was never supposed to be like that, so then kind of like why is it like the what if aspect?
Yeah.
Question. It's a question, but it's not.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, there is no question mark, right? Technically, at a syntactical level, there is no question mark. Yeah, but
it leaves us with a question.
It leaves you with, yeah, exactly, as the reader with the question, what if, which is then, of course, answered, or at least hinted at with the fact that the next line immediately hits you with two ifs.
Okay, but what if she was saying this like, all the skies my liver, you're being then she goes, like, maybe she sees some cool beings that sky was never my cool day.
Yeah. The regret element is interesting. That's one of the difficult things about poems like this that start what we call in media res. Do we know what in media res is? Yeah, I can write it on the board. No, it's fine. It's a Latin term. In media res. It means in the middle of. Right? It would be a rough translation. Yeah, while the story is happening is, I think, a more accurate translation. My Latin is not, it never was particularly good, but you might identify at least media here. Right? That's still the same term that we use today. But anyway, like that's one of the difficulties, to come back to your question, of starting in media res, right? In the middle. You don't have that context. Right? So maybe regret is one of them. And I think you're getting at something with the never. Right? It does imply maybe some form of regret. we'd have to read the rest of the poem in order to see if we can back ourselves up with that regret. Oops. If I died once, if I left the body, habeas corpus. Great pun there. On body and corpus. Right? The word corps in French literally means body, and it comes from corpus in Latin. So that's the joke. But if I died once, if I left the body, habeas corpus. To me, what strikes out the most here is that second sentence. Mm-hmm. If I left the body.
The body.
The body. Whose body? Her body? Is she creating a separation between I and physical body?
Previous life.
Previous life.
And habeas corpus. Can I say what it means?
Habeas corpus? Go, sure, yeah.
It means you shall have the body.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like it's something like previous life.
Absolutely. I'm looking it up just to not say something stupid.
Legally, it's like what you have
for unlawful detention. So you're required to take them to court to see if they're actually not unlawful.
Right. Exactly. So you're right on a technical translation, right? You should have the body, or show me the body. Basically, is the term, but. Invoking the legal procedure invoking the jurisdiction of a court to review the unlawful detention or imprisonment of an individual. Right? So not only is it a pun, right, a legal pun on body, right, and the fact that it means show me the body, but also it advances whatever story she's telling, which is presumably she is unlawfully detained. Or someone is unlawfully detained. At this point in the poem, we're not super sure, right, what's happening, but we know now that we can say it's her. Right? If I died once, if I left the body. Anything else we want to say about that? I have, where are my notes on that one?
Something very good.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Body. It's something like it's not like the person.
Yes. Which is emphasized, I think, by the use of Latin, right? Nobody uses Latin except pedantic teachers who want to try to sound smart, right? Or lawyers with their puffy wigs, right? Right? It's meant to be a very elevated and official sounding business. It is clinical. Systematic, yeah. Yeah. Good. Did you have your hand up, or you're scratching your head? Okay, good.
Liz Howard wasn't in this, right?
She is. Yeah.
Is it a matter of this is totally opposite of what everyone's saying, but is it a matter of the fact that they're more they think of themselves as spirits in the body, so that she's just leaving this body to take another one?
I don't know. So the difficulty.
As I say it sounded a little stupid.
It's not necessarily. It's not necessarily stupid. No, it's not stupid. I'll say that firmly. It is not. It is not stupid. My only issue is that it comes down again to a question that we talked about in class 2, which is that the speaker of the poem is not necessarily the poet themselves. And so it's not necessarily Liz Howard who's the narrator of the poem here. So that spiritual component of indigeneity doesn't necessarily translate. Right? So it could be, you'd have to find more evidence in the poem to back up that the speaker is indigenous of a specific type that believes that what you're saying. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. You had your hand up, Billy.
Yeah, but I was just thinking about it was the same thought as her, but I was like, when I first read it, usually it says I left the body, if you're spiritually leaving the body.
Yeah.
kind of where I was.
No, so I should add. That's why I'm saying it's not stupid, because the basic element I think holds true. If I left the body, implies some kind of separation that's happening, right? It could. The only issue that I was quibbling with is the fact that it's a specifically indigenous thing,
Oh, okay, I
right?
see.
Like, there's a million different.
You want me to prove it better than
Yes.
just saying because she's a
Exactly.
I
Yeah.
know what you're saying.
Because the element of mind body, that could be the I in this case, mind body, spirit body, religious, secular, however you want to interpret it, you can find a million different communities and ideas that try to get at that point, right? But the basic dissociation, I think, is true. For me, at least, the key term is dissociation. Right? However you want to frame it, whatever terms you want to use in order to qualify that dissociation, I absolutely agree with you all that that's what she's getting at. If I died once, implying if I died again as well, right? Once again. If I left the body, that dissociation. And habeas corpus. Anything else we want to say about what's at least interesting to me for habeas corpus, and then I saw your hand, is its irony. Do we all know what I mean by ironic? Because there's like the common way that we use it, and there's the actual way that it should be used. Like the Alanis Morissette song is not ironic, unfortunately. It's a banger of a song, but most of those things that she describes are coincidences, not ironies. Irony is when you're describing the opposite of what's actually happening, right? That's why when Morissette sings, it's like rain on your wedding day. That's not the opposite. That's just a coincidence of weather, right? But it's ironic to me to see habeas corpus here because, as you were pointing out, it's about rights, right? The rights of the accused. But in the context of the poem, as we're slowly unpacking it, we realize that she's not necessarily the accused. She's being treated like the accused, but she's the accuser. Yes.
I wondered if it would meant she was like detained in her body.
I think metaphorically you can absolutely make that claim. And whether you've experienced what's been described in the poem or not, I think the idea of feeling trapped in your own body is one that you can experience in different situations, right? This kind of catatonic state that we can sometimes enter in when we're being overwhelmed by something, right? I gave the example, we were talking yesterday about deaths in families, right? The way that people experience that sometimes can be, in a similar fashion, rather debilitating and dissociating, because you feel like you've lost something. You have, on a certain level. So being trapped in your own body, I think, can be a very good reading here. Yeah. Okay. Let's move on. I spent 25 minutes on the first poem. So we'll finish this poem and then take a break and then cover the other ones. This is not my grave. The value of a dead woman is that she cannot be killed again or cross-examined. The value in being dead, the dead woman at trial, is the crown doesn't represent you, regardless. To me, again, to me, this kind of drips of irony again, right? Obviously, the speaker is alive, otherwise they would not be able to actually articulate the poem. That's not true. That's a oversimplified reading, but right, there's almost a kind of there's a sense in which the speaker wishes they were dead. Right? Because you cannot be killed again or cross-examined, what a strong thing to put together, right? And again, put yourself in the shoes of the speaker in the sense of being questioned on something that you know is true. You know in your heart of hearts, right? I lived this, I saw that, I experienced this in this particular way, I know what I did. I know what I saw. And you're questioning me like I'm the criminal? Bear in mind that we still don't know what's on trial here at this point. So we're still asking ourselves questions as readers. Yeah, you had your hand up.
I don't know if I'm just reading it wrong,
Yep.
but it's like you said, the irony, but also contradictory because like the value of dead woman is that she can't be killed again, so or cross-examined, so victim.
Mhm.
But then the value in being the dead woman at the trial is the crown doesn't represent you regardless. Then that again makes you wonder. The first paragraph is yes, victim. Second paragraph is kind of like, are we talking about the victim now, or are we talking about the accuser? Like it's very questionable about who's at fault now.
Yes, exactly. And I think that would be the point.
Yeah.
Right?
The victim still needs a lawyer, though, right?
Yeah, the victim still needs a lawyer.
The crown represents victim, defense attorney would represent accuser. So by saying the crown isn't representing you because you're dead, regardless, I don't know, that's contradictory.
Right, but can you represent, right? You technically represent, I guess, a dead person, but more often than not, I think in the legal case, you're representing like their family or whatever, the bereaved, or you're going against the murderer, right? Or the criminal, right? Rather than representing the dead person, I think. Yeah.
I don't know if I'm like here
Mhm.
the other way, but like the way I got it was like more the race, like that it's an indigenous person. I thought the crown's not representing them.
Like they fail at their job.
Like
So what tells you that they're an indigenous person?
like more of that often.
Yeah. Okay.
Like,
So
that's it. But it's just like
so it's working by implication.
Yeah.
Right? Because the author we know is indigenous. But also
to me it kind of just sounds like an indigenous case. That like in that point of like that sentence like exactly I'm saying like they don't represent me because like they would try and go backwards like because they're indigenous.
Yeah.
But I mean, think it has nothing to do with that.
To be fair, also later in the poem they do say Miss Howard ? Right? Which enforces that connection in our mind, right? But at this point in the poem, technically we're still unclear on that, right? But the connections are there to be made, right? Is it the same Miss Howard? Blah blah blah. You can have that discussion until the cows come home, right? Just real quick on the crown here. The value in being the dead woman at trial is the crown doesn't represent you regardless. I think the term is worth considering because in Canada, the crown is both the head of state, right, and the legal term for the prosecutor, right? If you're representing like the state or the people, right, it's the crown. And so you get this sense that not only is this person being cross-examined when they shouldn't be, at least again, that's the sense we're getting, but they're being done so by this faceless institution, the crown. Not the lawyer against me, not, the police officer who's across the table. At least that would be an individual. No, the crown. Even worse, right? Yeah. I'm skipping a few lines here, just for the sake of time. Towards the end, where we get a revelation of what happened. What did happen? Good. Not good, but correct answer. Swab taken of every orifice. Were there any identifying marks? Were you, in fact, on the moon that night, Miss Howard? Did you make a choice? I made a cut. It released something. I broke the line. So now we get the confirmation, right, that we've been kind of hinting at throughout the rest of the poem. Right? Get the confirmation that, no, she is not the criminal here under investigation. She is the person who was assaulted, potentially raped. Poetically, I think she's doing just something really interesting that you might identify. What is connecting all of these lines? Yeah.
I think I'm gonna have this wrong. I would say when she wished she was dead, so she wouldn't have failed the justice system.
I mean, yes. Yes, absolutely.
Not the answer to your question.
That's not the answer to my question. That's why it took me a second to think of what you were saying. Yes, so she was absolutely failed by the justice system, right? That is the implication of the poem. Actually, it's not too much of an implication. That is pretty much, I think, what's on the face of the poem. Okay, good. So then that confirms, right, the title of the poem that we were questioning on, right? What is the value of a certain thing, right? What's the value of all of that questioning? What kind of value do we associate to, in this case, a woman who was assaulted in the way that she is treated, or the speaker is treated? What kind of value do we associate to the juridical? Yes. Process? Judicial. Thank you. I was thinking of juridic. But yeah, judicial process. All of these are, of course, values that are questioned. Values, period, right? On a moral level. But again, just coming back real quick, just for the sake of poetic analysis, what terms are the connecting elements throughout these final lines? And when I say that, you can think also of the way that in that earlier stanza, right, the value kind of connects all of these. There's a repetition, right, that forces us to associate all of these terms together. So by the final lines, we get a similar thing happening, except it's not a repetition of exact terminology. But there is a kind of imagery being formed and carried through.
Like being berated by questions. Were there? Were you? Did you?
That's not what I was thinking of, but that is true, right? The questioning does carry over, right? Have you ever been asked a million questions at the same time and never had time to answer? You see that in a lot of ill-fated debates, right? Someone who doesn't want to actually have a conversation and just wants to berate you, they'll constantly ask questions and never let you answer. Right? Yeah.
She disassociates in the beginning, and then questions come in, and then finally she comes back to the body to the ending.
Mm-hmm.
You see a bit of a cycle there.
Yes. Good. So you see a cycle coming back around. Right? The dissociation at the beginning comes back towards the end, right? Were you in fact on the moon that night, Miss Howard? Right? Literally somewhere else, right? Anywhere else.
So the narrator is Miss Howard. She is the poet.
Yeah. Again, it's a thing in poetry where
another Miss Howard.
but you only get that confirmation at the end, right? And you're right in saying, like, is it just someone with a different name, right? Did she actually experience this? I can't speak for Liz Howard, of course. I can't help but think, and this is not like this is not pro-poetic analysis. In French, we actually have an expression that would tie this to a dissociation. In French, we say "j'étais dans la lune," which literally translates to "I was in the moon," right? And it means my mind was elsewhere. Yeah.
Like head in the clouds.
Head in the clouds. Yeah, that's exactly that. Yeah. That's still not the actual thing that I was looking for as an answer, but these are good answers. So I can't help but connect, right? Orifice, marks, cut, broken line. Right? They're all some kind of visual reminder over and over and over. Right? Some kind of, say, every orifice. Right? This is going to be an awful, like, the worst mouth you've ever seen in your life, right? Because I cannot draw with chalk worth a damn, right? Identifying marks, right, on an arm. I made a cut, right? And I broke the line. Right? Throughout the entire last section, right, you get this repeated imagery. Right? That even if you're not consciously aware of it, right, you're not identifying it necessarily, is something that drives the poem forward. And it's never a bad form of poetic analysis if you want some kind of indication to identify those symbols and images that drive the ideas forward in that sense. Right? Lee, you had identified one earlier of starting with dissociation and ending with dissociation. That's a similar type of pattern. Right? You had your hand up. No? Okay. It's kind of hard not to read this in the context of the missing and murdered Indigenous women cases that, yeah. It's not said explicitly, of course, but I think it's very difficult not to at least have it in the back of our minds. Yeah.
Is there at all, like, is it wrong to see, like, when she talks at the start, like, about if I left this body, like, making it as though death is a choice, and I'm talking about I made a cut, like, I broke the line. Is it at all wrong to make the connection of, like suicidal?
I wouldn't say so, no. Right? Made a cut in what? Right? But then, of course, right, this is not my grave. Right? There's the explicit association between the speaker and death. Right? That whether it's suicide or a willingness towards death is certainly there. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
When I heard like it released something, like it made it sound like it's like coming awareness,
Yep.
like releasing. But then like when it says I broke the line, then you kind of make it like go back to you released it, but like was it in a bad thing? Where she said broke the line.
Yeah, that one's always puzzled me. Like, what line are we talking about? Right? It's also the moment in the poem where I made a cut, it released something. Notice that it's kind of a return to full stops that had been stopped for a bit. The last time there was a full stop was at orifice, and then there was nothing for a bit, and then another full stop. Kind of enacts what it says, right? I made a cut, dash, it released something, stop. And then it broke the line. Yeah. I broke the line, literally breaking the poetic line. Right? Maybe the line is
The line of questioning.
The line of questioning, right? Provides an opportunity for different possibilities, right? The line is obviously something that we follow. Right? If you break it, it's something that you no longer no longer have to respect. Right? I can't help but think with poems like this of Sylvia Plath, if anyone has ever read her. Famous now for her novel The Bell Jar, which was written right before she committed suicide. She's also an accomplished poet, or she was also an accomplished poet. And she has a poem called Edge. And in referring to a dead person, she has a really haunting line that says, "The woman is perfected." One of those poetic lines that lives rent-free in my mind. Sylvia Plath.
What collection is that one in?
Good question. Couldn't tell you. Because I've read it in an anthology, but I can look it up during the break. The woman is perfected at the moment of her death. And it's not... I don't know if it would be reading too much into it. I don't think so, right? But very much being accusatory of this type of discourse that you kind of see here, right? With the earlier poems, with the earlier lines in the poem of talking about the value of the dead, right? The value of being dead, the value in being a dead woman, right? Of this untouched, right, person on which violence has been enacted, right? But that people can still come in and swoop and save on a metaphorical level. I don't know how to end that aside from that in that way. Yeah. How does this decolonize? Can probably interpret it in a few ways, right? Just the mere pointing to, right? Identification of. And this is true of all kinds of people, right? We're talking about it in the context of missing and murdered Indigenous women, right? But also just the way that many people in my life have identified the way in which they were questioned by figures of authority, right? Indigenous or not, right? So that questioning of power structures in that sense is very good. I know to take a break when everyone is absolutely silent in class. Seriously though, all jokes aside, does anyone have any questions or? Nicely done on this one. Come back at 45.
Elliot.
Oh yeah, I've taught 34 grams per dose to students in college before.
Is that a poem?
No, so she wrote a collection of essays titled "A Mind Spread Out on the Ground."
Yes, I read that.
Right, but there's a chapter in that that's called 34 grams per dose.
I remember chapter.
Oh, okay, sorry. No, fair enough, honestly.
She also wrote a horror book that was very good.
Did she really? What's it
I
called?
don't even really like horror books.
I love horror.
Remember. But it was nominated for the Women's Prize for Fiction, and I decided to read the long list that year.
Oh, yeah.
Just because she was on it.
Oh, and then she fell.
And then she fell.
Yes, I've read that.
It's good.
Yeah, it's pretty good. I actually hesitated to talk about it in this class.
Yeah.
But I was like, oh, okay, we already have 2 novels, and then it's longer than the other novels, so I figured, but yeah, it is good.
Why would she chose that?
Yeah.
It's fine.
Guess we'll have to talk about World War I instead. Ugh.
Well, I mean, instead of the Marrow Thieves.
Yeah, that's true. The Marrow Thieves is also. Speaking of horror, has anyone here seen Obsession?
I've read the Wikipedia page of it, and that's enough.
Yeah, no, that's fair. If you don't like horror.
I've seen commercials of it. It looks interesting.
It's fantastic.
Really?
I mean, if you like horror as a genre, it won't disappoint, but also just thematically, it's quite interesting, and it's.
Is it more thriller, like psychological?
But
pure horror.
well, there is a psychological element to it, just by what the main conceit is, right? I'm not spoiling any, but you know the main conceit, right? The guy wishes for something in particular, so the psychological trauma of that wish is a very prevalent element, but it's also extremely horrifying in a gratuitous way sometimes.
Yeah, I looked it up because I like the theme of it. It sounded really interesting. But then I read like a plot, like I started to read about like some of the scenes, and I was like, nope, I don't want to watch that.
No, I mean, you can cut out all the horror scenes. All right, so let's get started again. Oh, you're talking about the movie. Yeah. It's wild to me how people are very much misrepresenting it. It's like, oh, it's a deliberate attempt to keep her against her will. I'm like, no, it's kind of missing the point.
But I feel like it wasn't horror.
Oh yeah,
Horror that would make me not sleep at night. But like,
my partner actually did not sleep after it. Yeah, she genuinely was like, I couldn't,
because I
and
like
she loves it.
this movie, I watched the afternoon and I couldn't sleep. This one was like, it was more of satire because he wished for her to be like that.
Yeah.
Basically, she was competing with herself.
Yeah. Yeah. No. Anyway, we can talk about it another time. But you're right. The satire is definitely present. Okay. So we talked about true value, and unless anyone has sudden thoughts that came to them during the break about the poem, we can move on to a different one. Going once, going twice. Sold. All right. Jordan Abel or the other Liz Howard poem?
Liz Howard.
Yeah, we'll just keep going on the Liz Howard train. Okay. All aboard the Liz Howard train. Let's go.
Can you remind me what the name of that Sylvia Plath poem was?
Edge.
Edge. Thank you.
Do you have her poem that's like a video? The audio.
For who?
The Liz Howard one, the watershed.
Oh, actually, that's a good question. I don't think there's a recording of it just because it's a bizarre poem.
Is that the other one you
No, actually, the Place of Scraps video is something else entirely that we'll get to if we have time, considering that it's almost 8 o'clock already, and that depresses me to no end. Let's see, watershed and shield reminisce. Are you asking because you don't know how to read it? Or you're just curious? Yeah.
Also, I like hearing them, like, the way they talk about it.
It's an hour and 50 minutes. I don't know anywhere in this. Okay, hold on. So while I'm finding this and half listening, what are our initial thoughts about Liz Howard's poem, Watershed and Shield Reminiscence? What came to us? What was notable? Where's the damn transcript? There we go. What popped out to us?
It's like about pollution and lost indigenous ways, like my great-great-grandfather taking the trash, but that's not a thing anymore. It's all destroyed now.
Absolutely. So on a thematic level, no. Okay, so I'm not going to keep staring at this. I'm sorry. I cannot find a recording. So on a thematic level, right, the pollution is front and center. Okay. Good. What else? Which one is watershed? Which one is shield? In this poem.
I think shield is
This one? What gives that away?
because she basically like sometimes goes on music if the owner has the more important than the second chorus like that. I've read that writing.
Okay, so you're right, making that association. Good, yeah. Um,
So it's clear to shield in the form.
yeah. Somewhere.
It says watershed there at the top.
Oh yeah, in the watershed. Right. Good. So there are certain elements here and there that place it also.
It's in it. I didn't mean like it says
Yeah.
it at the top.
Using dynamite to clear the shield. There you go. When she says the shield, what's she talking about? Ooh, okay. That's something I'm taking for granted.
Is it like making the highways or making the railway?
In part, by extension, it's a geographic space. If anyone knows that.
She talks about glaciers clearing.
Like 90% of Canada is the Canadian Shield on a geological level. So basically, these highlighted elements are a rock formation that we call the Canadian Shield. And it is some of the hardest and densest rock formations on the planet. Okay? This is big geology nerd time, I guess. And what she's describing in parts of the poem is how it was created over centuries of erosion, right? A huge part of that actually used to be glaciers. Okay? The only remnants that we have of those glaciers are the Great Lakes. Okay? Most of the rest of it was eroded down, and it's part of what creates the tributaries and thousands of rivers that we are blessed with having in Canada. So when I ask which one is shield and which one is watershed, it's a bit of a trick question because they're inevitably tied together. Right? The formation of waterways, the erosion, the rise and fall of tides is what in part created the Canadian Shield as well. To go back to the railway point that you made, Mel, this was, of course, a major problem, so to speak, for the constructors of the CPR, the Canadian Pacific Railway, in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, because it is very difficult to dynamite through such dense rock, right? Just on a purely technical level, especially with dynamite from the 19th century, which, like everything else in the 19th century, sucked, right?
Not everything.
Name me one thing that was better in the 19th century.
Better or just good.
It was just
Women was from the 19th century.
Fair enough. A lot of things were
Middlemarch.
Middlemarch, yeah, okay, fine. They had some good stories, I guess, in the 19th century. Sorry, what's up?
No, I was asking what was that?
What was what?
Middlemarch.
Middlemarch? Oh, it's a novel by George Eliot, which was a pseudonym for...
I can never remember her name.
I can never remember her name because we only refer to her as George Eliot, but it was a pseudonym used by a very famous woman writer in the 19th century. Middlemarch is a brick of a book because it was the 19th century and people had nothing better to do.
It's great though.
It's apparently. Never read it. But yeah. I've read Silas Marner, which... Yeah. Anyway, so one of the most popular Victorian novels of its day. But yeah, so that's what she's referring to essentially when she's talking about the shield. Okay? Is this big chunk of territory. Okay? Which, of course, once you get past, from the CPR perspective, the Canadian Pacific that you're talking about, you then hit the Rocky Mountains. So really, it's genuinely a feat of engineering that any kind of railway was built across the Canadian landscape, or even the Trans-Canada Highway, to be perfectly honest. You can say what you will about car culture. The fact that we managed to build a highway over that is patently mind-blowing. Anyway, that's not what the poem is about, so I'm going to stop my enjoyment of modern engineering. Out of curiosity, how did you guys read it? Did you read it one side and then the other, or one line at a time?
I tried to read it one, but
Yeah. Okay, so most of you just went one line and then another?
I did it like this.
You did it like this the entire time? Oh,
I
God.
felt like they were both replying to each other. Like,
Yeah. I did both the, one side and then another. And then I did one stanza. I think it works both ways. I think you're right. If you want to make them have a conversation with one another, you can't go line by line. You have to go stanza by stanza. So amid moonscape railings, cognition drained its basin. One brother was born on land black from mine. So technically, I guess, even if it's two different people or two different entities talking, what you're setting up here is the origin stories, I guess, if you will, the start of their stories. And so you're going back and forth in different periods. Good. Anything else that we've noticed? We'll read through it, but I'm just I'm curious about initial thoughts. Okay. So you read already True Value, so we'll leave you. Does anyone want to read the watershed side? Moon? Anyone want to read the shield side? Lee? Okay, good. We'll go stanza by stanza. So, Moon, read one stanza, and then Lee, you'll read the next stanza. Okay?
Mid moonscape railings, confession drained its basin.
One brother was born on land blocked from the mine.
All ventricles sap and terminate the girlish toss of stones into water.
Sulfur, apartment.
Limbs angled and familiar as industry, these days without antidote, tumbling into silt.
Dead and still the water. Great-grandfather worked the old trap lines.
Sleek as a gray with another cadaver lake, round seafish of acids, hydrochlorics at the railroad.
To a highway with horses using dynamite to clear the shield the glacier had worn.
Came after the caribou or smoke to crack the sky open this caustic history of moisture.
A nest for the river, his horse fell down its bank into a shattered femur.
Before the caribou, metabolic alleys diverged into currents and embryos, cracked the sky into a filter of words, mutagenic.
Nothing for the horse but the dynamite placed it lit within its mouth. Empathetic demolition.
Lacks sucrose, no repinephrine.
Nice.
Flow the soul, blinking traffic light in the center of
Whether our engine of the possible, ask this atomic history of silt in the watershed.
of town, an elder amputee from the farthest reserve.
This lift of waves recurrent from this shed, all water flows north.
Placed his last hand on my brow, called upon Gitchy man to
The memory of sleep, where I am bored and falling through each level of a house.
to secure my exit from problem.
There are four corners, piles of clothes, carpets of old smoke, a staircase, mummified, placenta, brittle, slanted blinking, a soft drip, to when the cement floor signals.
Awakening.
A much more abstract poem, certainly, than True Value. Right? But one of the I guess the value, if you want to reuse that term, of reading it stanza by stanza, right, one across, is that it emphasizes to what extent both sides follow a similar process, right, of starting off in a very particular setting, right, almost idyllic, Right? Amid moonscape railings, cognition drained its basin. Moonscape railings is an incredible image, right? To me, it invokes the like moonlight streams, right? That go through a tree or something like that, or when it's a cloudy night and you see a little bit of light going through. That's what comes to mind. And even if it's a darker image on the most literal level, one brother was born on land black from the mine. You still see this kind of literal birth, right, of a figure from the soil or from the shield. And then as you go, as we rightfully pointed out earlier, you get into different kinds of transformations on both of these landscapes, right, or both of these ecologies, I should say. The mining of copper, silt, the construction of apartment buildings. Don't see it as much here, at least not in the section of Brandon that I'm at, but that's the plague of Montreal, is that we keep building condos that we don't like. Just endless condo buildings for no one. So you see this kind of addition and piling on throughout the poem. Right? It is this process of accumulation, so to speak. And that use of the term accumulation, to me, is one of the ways in which the poem does kind of blur the lines between which one is shield and which one is watershed. Because you don't really, I think, maybe I'm just speaking for myself, imagine stuff accumulating onto water. Right? Like usually we imagine water as more porous. If you drop something into it, it just falls to the bottom, right? Or it mixes in with the water. Whereas if you're talking about rock, right? Literally rock, of course, is sedimented by its very existence. Crash course of geology, that's how rock and earth is formed. Movements of plate tectonics that pile on top of each other. But also just literally stone and silt, right? Sulfur, all of this kind of piles on top of each other, and with water and movement, it creates layers and layers and layers. And yet, both of these sides of the poem demonstrate this kind of accumulation. Accumulation of pollution, accumulation of history, which is maybe an interesting thing to consider, right? What does that mean to accumulate history? And to crack the sky open, this caustic history of moisture. More explicitly, the accumulation of history with the creation of the railroad, which is also mentioned in the water section, or the horses and the highways. So all of these elements kind of come together, right, in order to create this new thing. It's still technically recognizable as watershed and shield, right? Like still today we can identify the Canadian shield underneath our feet, technically. But I think it's a really important interjection into how these things that we don't necessarily consider do have a visible impact, right? Material impact and discursive and ideological impact on these entities. Right? Obviously, it changes the watershed and the rivers to have copper in them. Right? They were never meant to have copper in them, at least not on the levels that we do now. So in the True Value poem, we talked about how the speaker was presumably, for most of it, a woman, certainly, and then at the end we kind of get the confirmation that it's Miss Howard, or someone named Miss Howard. So a visible human speaker that we can imagine. How would we qualify the speaker of this poem? May seem like an obvious question. Who is actually stating it?
You had said this when we were talking about just determining if the interest, and I forget how you worded it, but in this case, like I don't think the author isn't the speaker. How would you call it though? Like I think it's just someone narrating a story. Like it doesn't really seem like there's a person.
Okay. Key term here. There's no person narrating the story. I think I would agree with that.
Except at the bottom of the watershed.
Up, like go up. Oh, in a memory of sleep where I'm 4.
Yeah, that one.
Sure. There is a brief moment. In a memory of sleep where I am 4 and falling through each level of a house. And then to secure my exit from poverty. But for most of it, you don't get that indication of personhood necessarily. Right? And to me, this can indicate two things. One, the person was just obfuscated, right? We just didn't focus on the human narrator, right? To put it in these terms. And it was all about this nameless speaker thinking about all of these accumulations, which is a perfectly valid way of thinking of the poem. But then the actual title of the poem, kind of goes against that. Why?
So the word reminisce would imply somebody thinking on the past, or even like a discussion between two people on the past.
Yeah. It's not, I am reminiscing as Watershed and Shield would. That's not the name of the poem. Who's the subject of the title? In like the grammatical sense of the subject. Yeah, it's Watershed and Shield. Good. So there's something really interesting going on in the sense that if there is an actual narrator, I, at the end, right, who's 4 years old, presumably a human, then it's an interjection in a poem whose speaker is actually non-human. Or they're a part of the wider dialogue. Right? There's a few ways that you can maybe articulate that. Yeah.
Like it would be like Watershed is the speaker on one side, and then the other side the speaker is Shield.
Yes.
And then there's personified in the bottom part.
So personified could be one of them, but then how would that personification work?
I might be missing that word.
Because personification means that, I don't think they're necessarily misusing it, but like we're attributing human qualities to a non-human thing, right? So it could work, technically, but what would be the mechanics of that? How does a watershed sleep? And, actually, it could work.
Water falls. Water falls through.
Still water falling through a floor? Of course it could. Right? Yes, you're right, it is personified with the use of I in that sense. Or you could take the even more radical position and say it's not a personification and it's a self-identification on the sake of water. Right? Now we're getting into some real rad stuff, like water as a self-identifying element, or water capable of agency, which I wholeheartedly believe, by the way. I'm not even saying that as a joke. I do think non-human elements absolutely have agency on this planet. And at some point, water was formed, right? Every piece of water, right, by the transitive properties of science, right, was 4 years old at some point, right? Like we even if we don't think of it in those terms, right, because why would we? A drop of water had been 4 years old at some point. Now it's just like mixed in with the rest of the water, and it's billions of years old. But 4 billions. I don't know when water first formed on the planet. But which one do we find more convincing? Is it the non-human that's speaking, or is it an interjection of a human speaker in the middle right there? Mixing both entities, right?
Water, like for the water, watershed, I would say like the personification, but for shield, like self-identification.
Okay, why?
In shield, you never actually say like. I think it's just the wording, like it's a lot. You have an over in watershed, but in the other side, it's my brow. Like it's not quite as like.
Yeah,
I guess.
I'm looking for the section that says my brow.
Further down.
Further down. Yeah, placed his last hand upon my brow, called upon Gichi Manitou.
There's also my brother and my great grandfather. Well, not my great grandfather, just his great grandfather.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no use of personal pronouns in that one. Just a great grandfather. Could be a great grandfather, the great grandfather, my, his great grandfather, her great grandfather. Could be anything. We don't know.
Do you know what Gichi Manitou is?
Does anyone know the answer to that question? So Gichi Manitou, there's a few different translations depending on who you ask, but in many indigenous cultures, it's roughly the equivalent of Great Spirit. Right? If we want to take the decolonizing reading, there's a lot of Christian settlers and priests who, in trying to convert the indigenous population, grabbed onto the idea that there was such an easy parallel to make between Great Spirit and God, right? And just use that as a very effective conversion tool. Right? I am not a theologian, as you know, so I cannot speak for the actual distinctions between the two entities, right, on a religious basis, but I do know that that's the rough translation, would be Great Spirit. Okay. What do we make of that big gap at the end? Is it a big gap? Secure my exit from poverty. Poverty of the soil, presumably. Right? Overexploited.
Are they like? Is it now merging at the end?
I think so.
Becoming one, because then like we're talking about the dream, and then it says awakening. Like it's like they gain something from this knowledge of like memory of sleep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think she's getting at emerging, even if it's put on one side. I'd have to see it. I'd be curious to see it on the printed page to see if it looks a little bit different, because I found this on the website, of course, and sometimes the layout is a little bit different. So I'd have to actually check it out in Infinite Citizen of the Shaking Tent. But yeah, so not only does this side continue, right, each level of the house is the water kind of, I think, dripping through piles of clothes, carpets of old smoke, and the staircase, and so on. But again, you get this element of accumulation, right? All of these things just listed one-on-one. There's no story anymore, right? It's just thing, one on top of the other. And the use of terms like mummified and brittle do bring to mind at least older things like stone. Fossils, for example, right, is literally mummified stone. I don't know if people know this, like they're not actually bones, they're stone that was worked into the shape of those previous skeletons. Brittle, of course, some stone is very brittle. Right? So I think you're rightly in that it does seem to be some kind of combination. And of course the use of drift and cement. But then why the gap? Why put it all the way to the side, right? Why not just put it in the middle? Yeah.
Because that comes back to the self-identification. I think I had it backwards when I originally said like the watershed is the self-identification, and then the shield is the personification because it's becoming a bit more personal, and then they combine to like end together. But because the watershed is like I using the word I, it has more to say.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And then that would tie into how at the very end the last word is awakening, right? A kind of a self-awakening on the part of the earth. Is that it? Okay, that makes sense. I can buy that. I'm not gonna take a firm position on that because I can see it going both ways. But that makes sense. That tracks in my mind. Yeah, definitely. Anything else that we want to mention about this one? It is a trickier one, like we said, more abstract. No, yeah, go ahead.
You want to think of how the points and then departments of schools.
Yeah. Yeah, it doesn't really match necessarily as far as imagery is concerned, right? Which is why I think it makes sense to say that it's water speaking here, and they're going through these elements as well, like these artificial elements. Right? You can get water on your clothes, and it'll go through it right? In a similar way, right? As it'll go through layers and layers of stone. So it's a poem in that case that's playing with your expectations of how ecologies work, right? What interacts with one another. It's a poem that plays with your expectations of agency. What speaks? Who speaks for it? Which is something that we talked a little bit with when we were talking about Daphne Marland, right? Speaking for the river, right? Or speaking for the Japanese Canadians through the fish, the dead fish. You get a similar thing here, except of course taken even further. And so what you can start to actually see in a lot of the literature is how I'm an English teacher, not a math teacher, 50 years between Daphne Marland and someone like Liz Howard, you see the evolution of how we understand the world around us. Because it's not when I say I do believe that a lot of these things have agency, right, around us, this is not a particularly controversial opinion in academia, right? Actually, a lot of earth scientists have been saying this since the 90s, for example. Right? This poem is simply the culmination of a lot of what we've been talking about, at least in the mainstream, for a few decades now. One could argue that part of Howard's decolonizing poetics, to come back to our niche term for the day, is that this has always been part of Indigenous discourse, right? Or at least her Indigenous discourse. And you do see that in a lot of different Indigenous communities and the way that they talk about the earth and the non-human as being co-creators in the world. So you can argue that that's part of the decolonial practice of the poem as well. I'm sure you've identified it, but there's probably something to be said as well about how the poem is responding to the way that we treat those supposed co-creators of meaning. I was mentioning earlier, right, how pollution is colonialism, right? That book. It's very easy, I think, after we've had a discussion about this for about 2 hours, right, how that logic might work, right? The way that certain interest groups will exploit very specific parts of the world, right? Our minds, Canada, for example, just to come back to our focus in Canadian literature, for those of you who don't know, Canadian companies, right, are one of the number one mining producers in the world, right? Mining exploiters in the world. Not only in our north, right? We have a ton of mines, right? But also literally everywhere. We have a bunch of companies in South America, right? And it's not technically ownership, right, over the country itself, but it is a form of imperialism. Right? Comes back to that example of Mali that we were talking about earlier. And so to talk about this in such an explicit way, I think, is very much part of Howard's decolonial practice. And just to give you a sense of this on a literary level, we don't have to read all of this, but this completely serious poem really gets at the heart of what I'm talking about. So the other day I was in the library and I was reading through some books, a collection, and this is from a book, it's from a book that collects basically a bunch of snippets of people writing about Canada. Okay? In prose, in poetry, in nonfiction. It's just like a collection book that I happened to pick up for completely unrelated reasons to this class. Right? And this guy, whose name I forget, I wrote it down and I'll pull it up later, basically wrote a long poem describing what Canada is. Right? Each stanza begins with "You are X." Right? Notice what he's talking about here. Just the first few lines, you get exactly what I'm going for. You are the miner's drill that bores into the rock, that bores the rocks deep in the belly. Belly, by the way, coming back another time in a class completely unrelated. Deep in the belly of the mineraled hills, you are the Precambrian shield, the precious ore, the shouting dynamite that flings it free. You are Naraba, Brannon, and lakeshore lines, so on and so forth. This guy completely seriously is saying, you exist to be mined. Which, when I found this, floored me. Right? To see it so explicitly, I was just, damn. I think she's absolutely responding to things like this. Okay, what was the name of that guy? Do I have it here? Just for the sake of completion.
Can I take a picture of this?
Yeah, of course. You don't need to ask. You can take pictures of everything. Oh yeah, there we go. Dick Dieshbecker, in a poem called "Between Two Furious Seas." I think he was a journalist by trade. I looked him up very briefly after, but he wasn't a poet initially. It was just some poem that he decided to write. Which is why I was kind of so surprised to find this, right, of all things. Yeah, we don't need to analyze the hell out of it. There's not much to analyze in it. I just wanted to use this as a good compare and contrast. Okay. There's also something this may be stretching it, but not really, actually, considering that she uses references to the Gichi Manitou, right? And I don't expect you to know this, so I'm just launching it here to add to the completeness of this poem. Part of what a lot of modern literary critics who are interested in Indigenous and Canadian poetry have noticed is the way in which poets and writers like D.C. Scott and like Dischbecker, right, would refer to Indigenous populations using very specific terms of geology. And I think we should take a second to really think about that. The example that comes to mind is in a novel I read not too long ago called The Viking Heart, which is a typical immigrant story, right, from the 1920s. In this case, about an Icelandic family who moves to Western Canada. Right? It's a very normal story, and in the middle of chapter 1, right, the Icelandic family who's just arrived in Canada sees an Indigenous person, and what's the first thing they qualify them as? Brown as copper. Now, as an image, right, you can imagine that, right, a specific shade of brown. But the use of copper is surprisingly prevalent and recurring in those kinds of narratives. The use of geological and mineral language is surprisingly recurrent, right, as entities close to the land and therefore exploitable and mineable. For their stories, a la D.C. Scott, right, or for their labor, if you want to take a more left-leaning perspective on it. Right? So I think all of these are circulating around in Liz Howard's mind. Right? Whether it's mentioned explicitly, right, or not, I think these mixings of pollution and exploitation and references to Indigenous heritage kind of lean into all of these coming together. Did I lose you all? Okay, good. Ish. Any final thoughts on this? If you want to write an essay on decolonizing poetics, I think you would have the most easy time with this and Jordan Abel. Don't have to, I'm just saying, if that's like something that you're thinking about, you could probably go with these two. Okay. I need a drink of water. I'm kind of glad I get 3 days off after, because no offense to you all, you're all doing great. Speaking for 3 hours straight almost is devastating on anyone's larynx. Okay. Does anyone know who painted this? Very famous painter from British Columbia. She also painted this. She has a very distinctive style. I just took 2 examples, but she has dozens of exactly these types of paintings. As soon as I say her name, it'll probably ring a bell. Emily Carr. Does that ring a bell for anyone? Yeah. Okay. So she wrote also some books, but she's better known, I think, today as a painter. Right? There's still exhibits of her work, a little bit everywhere. Very good painter. Right? Obviously, she has some skill. that I will never achieve in my life. Why am I showing you these images? What's the first thing that you notice about them? The totem poles? Yeah, good. I think from a staging perspective, that's what you're supposed to concentrate on. Okay. Here, we'll use this one just because they're more front and center. Structurally speaking, this painting is perfect, right? It follows all of the rules that you tell someone to follow when you're staging a photograph. Centering things in a three-way is, perfect. Symmetrical. So we have the totem poles in both. There's always totem poles in all of this series of paintings. So what's associated with it in our mind? What do we think of when we see these totem poles? I'm sorry? Campsites. Okay, well, yeah. With the logs, right, potentially for sitting down. No campsite here, though. Tribes. Who said tribes? What kind of tribes? Okay. The fact that you don't know is rather indicative of the point.
Weren't a ton of the totem poles just taken casually? I don't know.
So when I was talking about associating indigenous peoples with a particular material and exploiting that, it's not random. It's not just a flight of fancy that I sometimes have, as you've probably noticed in these classes, right? This is something that actually happened. In none of Emily Carr's admittedly beautiful paintings does an indigenous person actually show up. And yet she would have known, they existed, right? She painted these in 1920s and 1930s. There are some today. There were indigenous people there at the time as well. Right? So she's selecting a very specific view of British Columbia, in this case. Right? In cultural theory, we call this a kind of reification. Right? The elevation of certain types of objects, right? In order to ascribe very specific cultural, political, or social meaning to them over things like people or labor or whatever. And that's exactly what's going on here. I say labor because the term reification comes from Marxist criticism, which used it to talk about capital, for example, and how we elevate that above people. But the same process is kind of happening here, right? We're associating this, all of these paintings, with indigenous people, which is, I think, what it's meant to evoke. But there's a dissociation at the same time that's happening. We don't have any of the specificities. What do these totem poles mean? What nation is it associated with? It's purely aesthetic, right? And it gave Emily Carr a lot of success, right, as a painter. Right? She was well regarded in her time. And again, this is not me just saying we should cancel Emily Carr, right? That's not what I'm doing. Okay, I really don't want to do that. I don't think that's a productive way of criticizing, right, any kind of cultural element. But I do think it's important to understand how these pieces operate and what effect they have. You look like you had a hand up. No? Okay. Good. You should. I mostly wanted to do this because I know that we're almost up on time here, but I do think it's worth emphasizing, right, why Jordan Abel is so interested in using the figure and image of the totem pole in his poems. Right? because I think, it was Ubili who was saying that they were often taken down and stolen in pieces, right? Yeah. Which is, of course, mirrored in his use of words that are deconstructed and piled on top of each other. You saw this in all kinds of cultures. I'm thinking of this because of the use of the term mummified in Liz Howard's poem. Mummies were stolen left, right, and center. For those of you who don't know, the Victorians ate mummies, right? Which is a thing. You can look it up. Awful stuff. Victorians were weird, as I said last time, right? For all kinds of reasons. So this idea of stealing, right, cultural property, cultural capital that has meaning to another culture, not only is a classic colonial move, but also belies a desire, I think, for someone else to establish their own form of small I indigeneity, right? To come back full circle, perhaps in a bit of a hand-fisted way, of answering the question, where is here, right? Which by extension is asking, who are we? In the most literal sense, I have no idea where this is. It is indistinguishable as a place for me from most places with a fence. So, while the totem pole is there as a symbolic level for someone like Jordan Abel and his poetry, there's another figure in the background. Right? Did anyone actually look him up? Who that figure was? I don't remember if in the poems that I had you read, he's mentioned by name. Yeah. Did anyone look up Mahir's Babel? The person who's quoted at the start? He's an anthropologist who is well known in Canada, or at least in anthropological studies, for having basically been the instigator for what we now know as mostly modern anthropology in Canada. And he did so by studying totem poles and indigenous cultures on the West Coast. And in the ultimate decolonizing move, I think, which is cool for us that we're finishing on him, right? And in a similar way, that should recall how terms are being reappropriated by various communities. Right? What Abel is doing in these poems is taking Marius Barbeau's words, right, and changing them up, reinterpreting them, poeticizing them on his own terms. Barbeau talked about his culture. Now I will talk about my culture in my way, using his words, right? Kind of mixing it up a little bit. Technically, we have a term for this in poetry. It's called found poetry, right? Which is exactly as it sounds. You find poetry in other sources. Okay? So you take a text, just any book, and take some words from that book until you find a poem. Right? Inspiration strikes you. Where is here? Jordan Abel, I think, gives us a great answer. We are here. Contrary to what Duncan Scott wanted in his poem and insisted on, insofar as the Indian was going to disappear, no. In 2016, Jordan Abel and Liz Howard were publishing poetry as Indigenous people saying, no, we are here. Last question, I promise, and then I'll let you go. I know we're getting tired. It's fine. It's almost 9. We can take any of the poems, but what do we make of these elements here, right? Because they're pretty much all of them. So there's the regular poem, and then there's the overlapping and distorted, fuzzy, staticky poems. What effect does that have on us as readers? Why would this happen? Whose words is he using in this case? If I'm asking the questions, because the answer is pretty much there.
Oh, is it Bargo's?
Mm-hmm.
He's like scrambling.
Yeah, good. So you can't see it because I only gave you a part of the place of scraps, so some of the words don't actually correspond with the text that's above, but some of them do, just by the transitive property of existing. So yeah, some of these words, right, carved totems no longer being erected to the memory of uncles, do show up, right? Carved totems no longer, for example, right here. It'd be one thing to say he's scrambling them, yeah, but he's repeating the same thing, one on top of the other, right? So it's, at least to me, it comes back to this idea of accumulation that we were talking about before. What kind of narrative has been accumulated and accumulated and accumulated onto us as people existing, on others who have to endure this over centuries or decades at the very least, and who then have to parse through these accumulations that are barely legible anymore in order to write their own narratives. But inevitably, those things are still there. Again, decolonizing, not post-colonizing. One can argue, to come back to the start of the class, that we will never be in a post-colony. When you think about it, the term post-colony implies that colony is still there in the work, right? Even if we are imagining something after, right? Post-colony. So how do you go past that? Is it another term? Is it a new term entirely?
Is it like postmodernism, where it's like a different movement, but it's on the what happened before? So modernism happened, and now there's a new movement. But it couldn't be called postmodernism if modernism hadn't happened, but it's a different movement.
Right. It's similar. Yeah, I guess you could make that claim. Yeah. Some people might even say that postmodernism is not a thing. I just like that poem a lot. It is even incorrect to speak of their nearest parallels. We are here. Logical causes may be given, but any given institution, lump of lead, interesting use of mineral here, lump of lead, river foam, etc., gives rise to actions, social practices, however slight. The only thing that's clear in these poems, right? The rest, all of those words are muddled and jumbled. And he does this quite a bit, right? In his new collection, it came out afterwards, called Nishka. He would do a similar thing, right? And this is actually not exclusive to him. I listened in preparation for this class to an interview with Jordan Abel that was done by Linda Mora, right? Who's a famous Canadianist. Famous. I don't know if there's any such thing as a famous Canadianist anymore, but well known in her field at the very least. I can try to link the interview in Moodle if you want. But she was talking to him about at the time his new collection Nishka, and she was talking about these gaps, right? These kinds of empty spaces that you can see in these poems a lot, and was repeated again in Nishka. And something that really stuck out to me was his inspiration for that. He got it from Amur Bese Philip, right? Which I had not planned, by the way, when I planned out this class. Like, I didn't know that connection existed. But he referenced something other than the poem that we talked about. He was talking about her collection Zong, which is a reframing of a slave ship that was crossing the Atlantic and decided to throw overboard all of its slave cargo because they would get insurance money anyway, and they no longer had any value for the life. Right? It was a whole big thing at the time. Right? We don't need to get into it. But Philip plays with that use of empty space as well, right? In order to talk about those spaces left in the historical archive, right? When talking about the slaves, which if you look at the case of Zong, and it went to court, right, for insurance purposes, not for life purposes, right? None of the slaves are ever mentioned, right, by name. And so it becomes this really interesting play of gaps and absences and silences that one must consider on how to put on the page. And I think Abel's adoption of this kind of poetic practice, you would inevitably have to call it, is so evocative to me. Right? I don't think he's saying, right, that there's a one-to-one parallel with being thrown overboard as a chained-up slave, right, in the 17th century. I doubt that's what he's saying, right? But he is inevitably talking about what kind of voices have filled in the gaps so far. And for him, at least, it's Marius Barbeau. And I think just the way that it's set up, right, that there is all of these gaps in the page, and the one thing that tries to at least visually take the most space is Barbeau's, right, and overlapping and the same words taking up 3 or 4 lines instead of the regular one. But ultimately, the practice being that they're incomprehensible words. Right? In trying to take up that space, they are not actually legible anymore. As a way to finish off the class, I've finished everything I've wanted to say, and I'm happy to take any questions. But what I found was kind of cool here on YouTube. You'll hear someone speak at the beginning, and it's never mentioned explicitly in the description. I think it's a recording of Marius Barbeau. And you'll notice that something really interesting happens in the video, because he's talking about the indigenous populations that he was talking about in his presentation, and you'll see what happens with that.
These drums are tremendous drums, such as the natives of Siberia use their ritual life and death. And such drums have been transmitted to the Indians of Northwest Coast, and they make them now everywhere in the Northwest. They are Buddhistic drums. of the natives of British Columbia, called British Columbia, and hung his dirt of the wood tree, large drum. But these drums are Hellenistic drums, such as the later Siberia used in their ritual of life and death. And such drums are Indians of Northwest. They are Hellenistic drums of the nation of Columbia. Here is the these drums are domestic drums, such as the drums I give you.
I'll see you next Monday.